Well, good evening, everybody. Good evening. My name is Michael, and it's my absolute delight to welcome you to tonight's treat and treasure that we're going to encounter as we learn together. We're here to hear about Emperor Haile Selassie in Bath and Wells, his journey and his faith. And I'm so looking forward to all I'm going to understand. This encounter that must have been in the 1930s between two very different worlds. 1930s Ethiopia and 1930s Bath. But it must have been an extraordinary encounter of faith and humanity, of discovery and understanding. And we're so glad to have our speakers here tonight who are going to lead us into this. So welcome to Ras Benji. Ras is the operations manager at Fairfield House, where Haile Selassie lived in Bath, and is a researcher about the emperor's life in exile. Professor Shawn Hailemariam Sobers will draw on his extensive work on Haile Selassie to illustrate the impact of the Orthodox Ethiopian Church within Christianity. But before our two speakers about Haile Selassie speak to us, we're absolutely delighted to have Paula, Ogun, Hector here, who is the artist and the curator of the Tapestry of Black Britons. And we're going to hear from you first, Paula. So welcome to Wells. Thank you for bringing your exhibition to us. And we look forward to hearing from you. Paula.
Welcome today, and I just want to say a massive thank you to Suzanne and Jess, because it was their enthusiasm for this project that's brought it here to Wells. And Jess said to me, we must have a fantastic learning programme around this. She knew I was a teacher for 7 years, worked with primary school, also secondary school, and I set up an autism unit. And I said, I do like to do, run workshops. And Jess said, we get lots of children in, and we'll also have the public programming. I'm waiting to work with Shawn Sobers since this exhibition is at the Argentini. He's very busy, very esteemed academic, so I'm very happy that I'm part of his event tonight, as it were, at Fairfield House. But so this project really began because I just love history, and I just love how, I suppose I'm interested in how people make sense of their lives and the world and why they do the things that they do, which I suppose is broader than we would typically think of as history, but that's sort of where I always started from. But when I was studying and when I was growing up in Britain, I never really got to learn anything about any kind of African or Caribbean history, not really. And certainly when it came to World War II, I had no idea about any African, Caribbean, Black service people, not a clue. So I would see the Remembrance Service celebrations and think, oh, okay, yes, of course we should remember them. But I didn't think it was anything to do with, people from the Caribbean. I mean, I'm born in Jamaica, half Haitian, but also British. I had a white stepfather from Derbyshire, who lived in Hampshire, Plymouth. So I feel like I'm a mix of all of these things. But I just felt passionately about bringing history to people in a way that different sorts of that offer different ways of engaging with history. Not everybody wants to read a book or watch a documentary, and especially thinking of some of those young people I've worked with, that they love to sort of have a workshop where you're going to engage with art or music or poetry as a way into the past. And I thought I just love textiles. I love, like most people, I love beautiful things. And embroidery, bespoke embroidery, it's just fascinating. And the technology now allows us to create an image like this, made with photographs that are made weavable. And because you can have a computer attached to a loom, although it's still hand woven, I wish I'd had the video just to show you quickly. Although they're still putting all the threads, the computer is understanding when to, the loom is making the loom move at the right times, so that the image will come out as I have created it digitally. After it was woven, I got some embroidery added in Bristol from a lovely lady who works in lots of churches actually, during the kneelers, lovely bespoke embroidery in Bristol. And then since this image has been created, before it came here, I got some embroidery from the Royal School of Needlework. some of that paid for by the company of Gold and Silver Wire Drawers. I'd never heard of the company of Gold and Silver Wire Drawers, by the way, but that's part of the journey of this project, is all the learning along the way, and I find it fascinating. So it would be lovely if you could come back in the daytime, because there's some lovely children's work. I've worked with 81 children so far, more next week, and they've created some portraits based on some of the people in the Tapestry. So you can't see it so well now, but I hope you do come back. Just before I hand over, I just wanted to say about why I had included Emperor Haile Selassie in this tapestry. I felt, the picture was amazing, and I thought, wow, he was actually part of the British Army, which I didn't realise as well, but he was also the only leader, I believe, to actually fight on the battlefield, which I thought was amazing. Thank you, Chris, for filling me in. I thought that, he was there fighting alongside his troops, which I thought was extraordinary. And so I wanted to include him, and also because in the tapestry I've got an image of the Princess Royal meeting some WAFs. I thought, well, if I've got, somebody from the British royal family, I want to have an Emperor from Africa. I mean, that for me was balance. So I'm so excited to find out much more about his journey, his faith, all of that. So thank you so much for being here, and I'm excited as everybody else to find out more.
Good evening, Bishop. Thank you very much, and lovely to see you all here. As we're in Wells Cathedral, I'm going to start off in a way customary to Ethiopian Orthodox Christianity. Basama Agwa World Mufeskadu Sadawama Amin. Basama Agwa World Mufeskadu Sadawama Amin. Name of the Father, name of the Son, and the Holy Spirit, one God. Amen. So myself and Ras Benji, both members of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, will be talking a little bit about that in our presentations. We're wearing the Natella, which is the traditional dress for men in the Ethiopian Orthodox service, or we usually also wear white during our services as well, and the women in the church also wear white, long dresses, head coverings, and this is a very traditional. It's an honour to be here. Thank you, Jessica, for the invitation to be here, and we're honoured to be part of your event, so thank you for bringing the tapestry, which is wonderful. So as said, we're going to be speaking about the journey and faith of the Emperor. We've kind of flipped this around. I'm going to be starting off talking about faith, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, and how it's established, how Ethiopia came to Christianity, and then leading up to his point in exile, which then Ras Benji will then illuminate that part of it. This is a photograph of the Emperor and the Empress, and you can see they're both kissing the cross. The Ethiopian cross is called the Meskel, and it's a very potent, important symbol within the church. And if you go to an Ethiopian Orthodox service, you'll see the priests holding the Meskel. And it's only the priests that are allowed to hold the cross, because they've got that particular significance. So just to introduce myself, so I'm a professor at the University of West of England in Bristol. I've been involved in Fairfield House since the mid-90s, really. I guess, early 90s when I started to go there as a member of the Rastafari community, but then very quickly got involved in kind of volunteering, research, made a film about Fairfield House, and been involved ever since, because it's a very beautiful, passionate place. This is me in 2023 in Ethiopia at the Yeka Abadu Deborah Mehed Church, which translates as Mountain of Medicine, Saviour of the World Church, and this is where I was baptised. And it's a rural church, as you can see here, and apparently I was the first adult to be baptised there, because in Ethiopia you get baptised as a baby, and also I was the first non-Ethiopian to be baptised there, so it's a real honour that they allowed me to go through that ceremony. It's been beautiful. Thank you. So, as said, I'm going to be talking about Ethiopia and how it got established with Christianity and the faith of Yahweh, as it's talked about in the Bible. So in 1 Chronicles 10 and 2 Chronicles 9, we hear about the Queen of Sheba, also Ethiopia, and how she meets King Solomon. And it's a well-known narrative within the Bible, Queen of Sheba goes to meet Solomon to test him on his wisdom, and then in that exchange she then brings the faith of Yahweh back to Ethiopia. In Matthew, Jesus talks about the Queen of Sheba example and rebukes the people because they're not listening to his message. And he says, the Queen of Sheba travelled all this way to get the wisdom, but you in front of me, you're not listening to my word. And it's used as an example, and then it's brought back in Luke 11. So it's a very powerful narrative within the Bible that's well known. This book, the Cathedral, which translates as the glory of the kings, this is an Ethiopian text, which from the oral tradition, and I'll explain the deep roots of the oral tradition, where that came from, but particularly in the 4th and 5th century. But then it was compiled into a book form from Ingese, which is the ancient language of Ethiopia, in 1314 to 1322. And in the Cathedral, it expands on the Queen of Sheba's story and basically expands on what's not said in the Bible. And I'll explain what that expansion is. So this is a painting which is based on the Cathedral and the Solomon and Sheba narrative. There's a lot of detail in here that it's hard to see, and there's lots going on. We've got a version of this at Fairfield House, so if you visit on a Sunday, we do public tours, and you'll be able to see this live. So the thing to concentrate on are these points here. So there's a famous seduction scene in the Cathedral, which I'm not going to go into detail, so you can imagine how it ends up. And when she returns back to Ethiopia, she doesn't only take back the knowledge and the wisdom of Solomon, but she also brings the faith of Yahweh back, but she also brings back in her belly a child called Menelik I, and he becomes the first of the Solomonic kings of Ethiopia. So in this part here, we see Solomon returning to Jerusalem and basically taking the Ark of the Covenant and bringing it back to Ethiopia. So the Ark of the Covenant, which holds the Ten Commandments, the rod of Aaron, Moses, which is contained, is brought back to Ethiopia, and it's said to still be in Ethiopia to this day. Queen of Sheba was the 95th monarch of Ethiopia, but Menelik I became the 96th monarch, but the first of the Solomonic line. And this gave birth to the rise of the Ethiopian Jews. Judaism has been in Ethiopia since that time. Beta Israel is how they're officially known, House of Israel. There's a more controversial title called the Falasha Jews, which means blackface, so that's not really a title that's kind of used today, but that's how they've been commonly known. The Beta Israel, they went through a whole process of having to prove to Israel that they were authentic Jews, and they passed all those tests in terms of their rituals, but even more ancient, that was practiced in the land of Israel itself, and many of them, returned to Israel in the 1990s, where they still reside, and they are citizens of Israel. And you can see here, some of the men have got skull caps. If you saw this image at face value, and you know about the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, you might think that these are Ethiopian Christians, because there's many traditions within Ethiopian Orthodox Christianity that have translated and overlap with Beta Israel. And it's very similar, lots of the dress, the customs, even the style of music. So there's a very strong overlap connection. So, as said, Ethiopia has been a land of Yahweh since the Old Testament days. So what about Christianity? How did Ethiopia come to Christianity? So there's two routes that Ethiopia came to Christianity, slightly convoluted, to bear with me. So first route was a very personal route. This is around AD 33 to AD 35. Jesus' ascension, just to put it in context, was around 30 to 33. So this is very close to the crucifixion of Jesus Christ and the ascension, very early. So in the book of Acts 8, 26 to 40, and I'm using the King James Version, so you know that this isn't a story that I've took out of my own Bible that none of you got. You've all got this in your own Bibles, and it talks about how St. Philip was on the road, and the angel of the Lord spoke to him and said, "Go towards the south, down towards Jerusalem." And he didn't know why, but he followed what the angel said. And then it says, as he arose, he went, and behold, a man of Ethiopia, a eunuch of great authority under Cadence, the queen of the Ethiopians, who was in charge of all her treasure, had come to Jerusalem to worship. So this is a man, he's an Ethiopian official, he's also a eunuch, but he's in charge of the treasures of the queen of Ethiopia. And he's come to Jerusalem to worship. So he was of the ancient faith. He was of the faith of Yahweh, descended from the Ethiopian Jews. So this is in the book of Acts. So he wasn't pagan, just on the track. He was a man of faith that had come from Ethiopia. And he was reading the book of Isaiah the prophet. So Philip went and spoke to him and asked, "Do you know what you're reading?" And the Ethiopian said, "Well, I'd like someone to help translate it for me." And St. Philip then helped translate it. But in that translation, he also spoke about Jesus, the good news of Jesus. And in that moment, the Ethiopian was converted and he asked to be baptized in the near river. And then that's what they did. And then the Ethiopian went forward to Ethiopia with the faith of Christ. So he converted from a Jew at that point to Christianity. And he was one of the early converts to Christianity and the first known Ethiopian to convert to Christianity. So he took it, as it says, on a personal route, a very personal conversion, and then influenced others around him. But one person alone isn't going to influence a whole nation, and this is where we have the second path of Ethiopia's journey to Christianity, which is about state endorsement and Ethiopia becoming a Christian state religion. So there's a slight backstory that I need to mention. So St. Mark, one of St. Mark the Evangelist, he travelled to Egypt and he established what was then known as the Church of Alexandria, which later now is known as the Coptic Orthodox Church. And he became the first patriarch, the first pope of Alexandria. So this is in AD 42. So at this point, Ethiopia had Christianity, but it didn't have a church. Because of the Ethiopian official, there was Christianity in Ethiopia, but Egypt had the official church. It had the trappings of the institution. 300 years later or such, in Ethiopia, there's something happened then that joined these dots together. So Christian Syrians, they were shipwrecked. They were named Frumentius and Odysseus. They were brothers. They were shipwrecked off Axum, and they were brought to King Ezana of Axum, which is in the northern area of Ethiopia and Eritrea. And there's lots of accounts that talk about how they were enslaved in the court of King Ezana. Enslavement in Ethiopia is very different to what we understand and hear about slavery today, but nonetheless they lived in the courts of King Ezana, but they also taught his children, the people around, but they also crucially brought Christianity with them. Eventually King Ezana converted to Christianity, and Frumentius caught the trust of King Ezana, and he was sent to Alexandria to get ecclesiastical support to establish Ethiopia as a Christian nation. So St. Athanasius, who was the patriarch of Alexandria at that time, he consecrated Frumentius to become the first pope of Ethiopia. But it was under the administration of the Church of Alexandria. So the Coptic Church, the Egyptian Church of Alexandria, that became the administrative headquarters of the Ethiopian Church. That's how these dots kind of joined together. So this happened in AD 330 to 340. So this is when Ethiopia officially then became a Christian country. And it was the third country in the world to have Christianity as a state religion. The first one was Armenia in AD 301, Georgia 326, then Ethiopia, and Roman Empire didn't officially adopt Christianity till AD 380, so it's significantly earlier. So a very deep, steeped with connection with Christianity that goes unrecognised. Unless you know, it's very difficult. This is a photograph of Lalibela in the north of Ethiopia, and it was commissioned or organised, however you want to say, by King Lalibela, and to cut these churches, these rock-hewn, cut out of the mountains. They're solid and cut deep in. There's 11 of them in Ethiopia. So he wanted this because when Jerusalem was controlled by Islam, King Lalibela wanted a new Jerusalem, a new site of pilgrimage, and Lalibela became that point. And it's it's a wonder of the world. It's absolutely incredible. I'd love to. I haven't been there. Ras Benji is fortunate enough to be there, and God willing, one day I'll get there myself. So how does Haile Selassie fit into all this? So you can see there King Solomon and Queen Makeda, the Queen of Sheba, and Menelik I. And then you see these points of the eunuch, King Azania. Haile Selassie is the 225th descendant of Menelik I. So he is of the lineage of those Solomonic kings. And there's certain, and I'm not going to get into this too deep, but there's certain biblical references which start to point towards Haile Selassie being a very significant individual. Psalm 68 verse 4, Psalm 68 verse 36, princes and princesses should come out of Egypt, Ethiopia should stretch forth her hands unto God. And there's many other passages in the Bible which speak about Ethiopia being a very important country, not only for the roots of Christianity, but also for the future of Christianity and Revelation and these kind of things. So he was born Lidge to Pharaoh Maconan. Lidge is a title that's given to a child. It essentially means child. Ras the Pharaoh became his name. Ras is duke or head. To Pharaoh, creator, Maconan. And then when he was crowned in 2nd of November 1930, he became Haile Selassie. Haile Selassie was his baptismal name. One thing I didn't mention on that slide of myself in the very first slide, my name's Hailemariam. That was my baptismal name that I was given. That's the power of Mary. The word Haile means power, and Mariam means Mary. I'll let Ras Benji talk about his very special baptismal name. So Haile Selassie, when you hear about Rastafarians, they've taken the name of the pre-baptismal name of Rastafari. But I'll come on to that a little bit later. This is just one quote from the Emperor. No doubt you all remember reading in the Acts of the Apostles how Philip baptized the Ethiopian official. He is the first Ethiopian on record to have followed Christ, and from that day onward, the word of God has continued to grow in the hearts of Ethiopians. In many of the speeches of the Emperor, 90%, if not more, the Emperor's speaking about God, he's speaking about his faith, he's speaking about these things. Even in very secular contexts, the Emperor would bring in his faith. He was very passionate about Christianity, about the worship of Christ, and I'll just show you a quick potted history of some of the significant moments in his life where he's had this influence on the church. So I'll quickly just run them through. As a child, he was born in 1892, he's educated by priests, memorised huge parts of scripture and the Psalms, and that might actually sound extreme, and it is impressive. But actually, in the Ethiopian church, even to today, the priests and the deacons, they have memorised most of the Bible. And it's incredible. But the emperor, from a child, was very faithful and had a very deep educational learning within the Bible. And he established habits of daily prayer and daily fasting. And this continued throughout his life. There's many accounts, even when he was in exile, that he would go to open a factory or something, and then it talks about it was a time of fasting, so he didn't eat, but politely had a glass of water, but he was fasting, and that continued throughout. As regent, as Ras, he reformed church education, revitalised monasteries, and encouraged theological learning. When he was crowned on 2nd of November, he was crowned the elect of God, the kings of kings, defender of the faith. Defender of the faith is a really important title that he took extremely seriously. Defender of the Orthodox faith, the Ethiopian Orthodox faith. But he was also very ecclesiastical. He was friends of many churches, many church leaders. We'll hear about him coming here, and he respected all faiths and all religions, but also he was very passionate about his own upbringing. But he also said that any translation of the Bible, and everyone knows the name of Jesus and can have glory in that knowledge. So he wasn't territorial or defensive about his faith to say this is the only way to do it. And I think that's an example that many of us can learn from. He introduced the first written constitution in Ethiopia, and he integrated, as it says, Christian moral law into the national governance. There's a document, an ancient Ethiopian document called the Feder Nagast, which is a book of law. But it's a book of law established by Ethiopian Orthodox morals, teachings and structures. And he brought those teachings of the Feder Nagast into the first constitution. He supported the translation of the Bible and liturgical text into Amharic from Ge'ez. Ge'ez is the ancient language of Ethiopia, and Amharic is the national language which is spoken in every day. So that is as significant as the Bible in Europe being translated from Latin to first German and then English. William Tyndale was burnt at the stake for translating the Bible into English. So taking it out of the hands to a certain extent of the priests, because not everyday language don't speak Ge'ez in Ethiopia, they speak Amharic. So he wanted just the lay people, the everyday people, to be connected with the faith and scripture in that way. And this was interrupted by the Italian invasion. First, its name was the Haile Selassie Bible, came out in 1935. Then there was a newer, updated translation that was published in 1962. So very significant. Because it's happening over there in Ethiopia, it can be underestimated how significant these things are. The Ethiopian Bible has 81 books. The King James Bible and books that many of us grew up with have 66 books. So the Ethiopian Bible has the Book of Jubilees, the Book of Enoch, the Book of Maccabean, and there's many books that actually were taken out of the Bible. They weren't added to by the Ethiopians. They had the original manuscript, and then during the various church councils they were taken out. But Ethiopia was like, well, this is the Bible we've got. We're not taking anything out. This is it. And that still remains to this day. So having that scripture, the Ethiopian Bible, I think is a very under-known and underestimated, powerful text, because it involves a much fuller narrative of Genesis, of Exodus, in the book of Enoch and Jubilees, etc., that you get in, what we grew up with, essentially King James Version. So that's still a story that hasn't fully been embraced by the West, and it'd be interesting to see whether it does. During exile, he continued public prayer, worship, Christian witness, trials of war. We'll hear more about that with Russ Benji. And he visited many churches, as we know with Wells Cathedral. And he built a chapel at Fairfield House because again, I don't want to steal your thunder, so I'll leave that there. But this became the first Ethiopian chapel outside of Ethiopia. So this is in 1937. Returning, he built many churches, clergy, spiritual life after liberation, wanting to get that spiritual root back, which had been tried to be compromised by Mussolini. Sacked churches, burnt monasteries, etc. So it's really important that the emperor restored them. So remember in the previous slide, I think, in AD 330, when Ethiopia became under the administrative head of Egypt. So all that time, the Ethiopian church was still being administered by Egypt. In 1959, the emperor managed to get what's called autocephaly, full independence for the Ethiopian Orthodox Church from the Coptic Church, which meant that the Ethiopian Church could establish its own priests, its own bishops, and its own patriarch, and it became independent of Egypt. They're still in what's called communion. What's now known as the Oriental or Orthodox churches are Ethiopia, Coptic Church, Syria, Armenia, Eritrea, and they're known collectively as the Oriental Orthodox churches. There's another set of Orthodox churches known as the Eastern Orthodox. That's Russia, Greece, some of the Greece. The name's escaping me at the moment, but there's a whole other cluster known as the Eastern Orthodox Church. And they're not in communion. There was a schism about the nature of Christ. This happened in 1054. And let me get my dates right. The schism with Eastern Orthodox happened in 451, apologies. There's so many dates, I'm having to remember. 451. And the schism came about the nature of Christ, because in the Council of Chalcedon, or Chalcedon, in now what's called Turkey, there was a debate about how many natures does Christ have. Is he divine or is he human? The Oriental churches, the belief up to that point was that there's no separation. He's fully divine, he's fully human, and there's no separation. The Eastern Orthodox churches said he's got two natures. He's divine and he's human. There's two natures within the one body of Christ. And they disagreed so much they separated. And they're separated to this day. So that happened in 451. Yeah? So, but when you look at it on paper, they're saying exactly the same thing. But it's worded differently. But this is how deep-rooted the passion is within Orthodoxy. That actually, they're staying fast to their theology and their understanding, and that's how it is. But they're, still friendly with each other, but theologically, they're very different. So just moving forward very quickly, 1965, thinking about this unity that does happen within churches, and we know that throughout all different denominations. The emperor brought back the leaders of even the Oriental churches and brought them together for a council of churches. So this happened in 1967. The last time that happened was in AD 431. So it's the first time in 1,534 years. Yeah, there's a joke within Orthodoxy that says, how many Orthodox does it take to change a light bulb? Does it need changing? Orthodoxy doesn't change. That's why it's called Orthodox. Orthodox means true faith. Yeah? So there's things like innovation doesn't happen within Orthodox. It's the authentic church is how it's described. From Jesus, with the apostles, and it's called the apostolistic tradition. Because St. Mark established the Coptic Church. St. Peter established what we now understand to be the Catholic Church. Catholic Church was originally what's known as Orthodox. All churches were Catholic and Orthodox. Orthodox means true faith. Catholic means universal. So the word Catholic wasn't a noun, it was a description. So the early church was just one church, not separated, and they were both Catholic and Orthodox. The date that popped into my head that I had wrong, which was 1054, that's when the Eastern Orthodox separated from the Catholics. They had a different schism, which I won't go into. But that side took the name Catholic, that side took the name Orthodox. That's why the Eastern Orthodox is still known as Orthodox, and that side means Catholic. But Catholics can still claim to be Orthodox in the same way that Orthodox can still claim to be Catholic. Because it's a description, not a name. Does that make sense? Anyway, getting too theological. Sorry, Bishop. Right, so the emperor brought back these churches for the first time in 1,534 years. That's a significant thing that he did. And then finally, 1960s, 1970s, he sent Abuna as a bishop, Yesahak, to the United States, to Jamaica, the Caribbean, to establish the Ethiopian Orthodox Church in the world, in the diaspora. And this was one of the first times that the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, if not the first time actually, had established kind of a mission operation to baptize Africans, particularly in the diaspora, Jamaica. The Rastafari movement had grown. Not going to get into that too deep, but Rastafari many Rastafari in Jamaica were baptized into the Ethiopian Orthodox Church as a part of that mission with Abuna Yesahad. So I'm just going to end with a clip of a film that I made in 1999 called Footsteps of the Emperor. And in this film, we're going to see two women, Waletta Mahidon, she's a member of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, talking about the spiritual life of the Emperor, and also Ruth Haskins. She was the nanny to the children, and she lived at Fairfield House. And they're both talking about the religious significance of the Emperor.
Well, the king is the head of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church is one of the oldest churches on creation. And whilst the king stayed at Fairfield, he travelled with his ajanas. So the church is of great significance within the king and the king to the church. So whilst he was here, there is many spots in Fairfield where the king did his morning prayer and his midday prayer and his evening prayer. And so the church is an embodiment of the king, It is of one.
They had their own church in the grounds at the back, and there were 3 Coptic priests here, and they normally wore their black robes all the time with little black hats on their head. The children told me that at the feast of the Passover, the emperor washed the servants' feet. So that shows you really that he was very intensely religious at that time.
Okay, thank you so much everyone. It's a great honour to be invited to give this talk today. Usually I'm giving a talk on a weekly basis at Fairfield House. We do a historical guided tour. It's very dynamic, we're moving around the house, there's different corridors that we're going through. So, different environment, but once it's settled in, it's all going to go well. So, I'm Ras Benji Haile Selassie, the operations manager at Fairfield House, which is the former home of His Imperial Majesty Emperor Haile Selassie. And I've been researching the life of Emperor Haile Selassie for almost 20 years now, since I was 18 years old. But this presentation today is a different perspective on the journey of Emperor Haile Selassie in exile, and it's told through newspaper headlines, through testimonial accounts of the time, and using resources such as the Emperor's own autobiography in addition. So let's get into it. Okay, so 1935 is what we're talking about. This is the second time that the Italians have tried to colonize Ethiopia. The first was in 1896, and that was the Battle of Agwa. And in this time, this is a different era that the world is going in for. Just before World War II, they've got strong, powerful military, air force. Italy has an overpopulation crisis, so they're actually focused on expanding their colonies, consolidating Italian East Africa. And so for the Emperor, Haile Selassie, he's actually getting ready to be a fighting emperor at this time. The King of Kings is a military position as much as it is a church position. He's at the top of the nation state, and the emperor has been in a militarized environment since he's 13 years old. He's reported to be the best shot in the newspapers. The actual Ethiopia is one of their best marksmen. So he's leading the Ethiopian forces on the battlefield, but he's leading his people that have not a great arms, and he's leading them against a force that's coming at him with chemical weapons. And this is the first time that the world has seen scenes that are far too common nowadays with that sort of heavy warfare for total extermination against the people that are fighting back at you. So this is a scene that the world has never seen before, and it's got attention in Britain. There's a lot of anxiety after World War I. Something's been done by the League of Nations Union called the Peace Poll, asking half the British public questions about the principle of collective security. And Emperor Haile Selassie, he does fight on the battlefield. He's here actually with his foot on an unexploded Italian bomb. And it's a story that we tell on the tours. The photographer that took that photo, he said he set the timer on his camera and he ran back because he was so scared that the noise from the camera would set off the bomb that the emperor is standing on. There's also some accounts of how the emperor's conduct was in the battle in Ethiopia. This is George Steer, who is a famous anti-fascist journalist. He reported on the Spanish Civil War. There's a statue of him in Guernica in Spain. Picasso did a painting based on George Steer's reporting. And George Steer said of the emperor in the battle, he said, as far as the emperor himself was concerned, his conduct during the offensive was irreproachable. He was always in the zone of artillery fire and continually exposed himself to danger. In the end, he went down into the plain and machine gunned the enemy himself with terrific effect. Also, the emperor's close attendant, confidant, Dr. Malaku Bayen, he said of this moment from another perspective, he said, he ordered, commanded, pleaded with us to let him die on the field of battle, but we would not do it. We brought him safely away. So the emperor, this is after the final stand really. He's led the Ethiopian army into head-on collision with the Italian army. He's also preparing his country for guerrilla warfare, but it's become obvious now that they're not going to be able to fight in terms of a straight battle against the Italians and to be able to conquer them in that way, in the same way that they did in 1896 at the Battle of Adwa. It's not going to be possible. So there's an acceptance thing going on with Emperor Haile Selassie, and he takes a pilgrimage to Lalibela, which Shawn talks about, the 12th century rock-hewn churches. And this pilgrimage, in this time when the Ethiopian army is retreating, was said by some people there was to become total madness. They didn't understand what the emperor is doing. He's heading back towards the Italians, but the emperor is going to see these rock-hewn churches, and he spends 3 days there. And George Steer, who was with him at the time, he says that for him, it was an aesthetically pleasing visit. He got to see the rock-hewn churches of Ethiopia, but he realized soon that for the emperor it was something totally different. It was a mystical pilgrimage for Emperor Haile Selassie in that time, and this is one of his last acts in Ethiopia. His government have come together, his council of noblemen, and they've actually voted that their emperor, they want him to leave the country in exile. So this is a difficult time for Emperor Haile Selassie. In his mind, he wants to die on the battlefield as other emperors of Ethiopia has. That's the brave thing to do, to fight back right to the bitter end. It's not looking like that is what the Almighty's will is for him, and he has to go through that acceptance process. So the emperor, leaving, he goes to Jerusalem, and I've put this newspaper report here, because for the Rastafari movement, this is a very treasured newspaper report. For the Rastafari movement, Emperor Haile Selassie is Christ in his second advent, the conquering lion of the tribe of Judah, the King of kings, the Lord of lords. And this isn't written by a Rastafarian person, this is someone in Jerusalem, a reporter at the time, and they're saying that Emperor Haile Selassie, he's talking like Jesus whilst he's in Jerusalem. If it's God's will, then I shall someday once again sit upon the throne of Solomon. And it says he looks like Jesus too. And then down here it says, Haile Selassie in Jerusalem startled the natives there. They said he looked like Jesus. This photo shows the resemblance to many paintings of the Nazarene. But this is just one interpretation, of course, because Emperor Haile Selassie, we know what he was up to in Jerusalem. He was in deep prayer during that time. This is a difficult time for him. He's maybe, during this period, experiencing what we might call post-traumatic stress. He's gone to seek out these holy places. He's trying to just have some stability in himself amongst the Ethiopian community in Jerusalem. Meanwhile, in the world, 1935, Ethiopia, Ethiopianism, support for Ethiopia is exploding. It's a worldwide phenomenon. Similar to support of Palestine today, all across the world there's protests kicking off. And in the UK, Sylvia Pankhurst, the famous suffragette, is one of those voices for Ethiopian freedom. She's constantly protesting. You can see her, this is actually from the women's rights protest, but this is her protesting the Italian fascist war crimes in Ethiopia. Africans throughout the diaspora, especially, these both photos from London, but this is from the United States with black people registering to lay down their lives for Ethiopia. Just time, again, another protest. I think this is actually Italian Americans that are protesting the Italian government in Ethiopia at that time also. So it's taking off. There's Ethiopia is in the central thing that everybody is talking about in every newspaper. People waiting for newspapers to be delivered to get that news from Ethiopia. Also, in popular culture in 1935, Emperor Haile Selassie and Ethiopia is making an impact. In 1935, in Christmas, the most sought after Christmas item that men were going out to the shops to try and find their wife was a Haile Selassie cloak. There was also a pair of stockings called Negus Brown, a new colour of stockings that were very popular for ladies to wear in this country that people were buying. And in Liberty of London, famous for making their dolls, they were making dolls of Emperor Haile Selassie and the Empress during that time. Hopefully one day, some will come to our museum at Fairfield House. So Emperor Haile Selassie, on June the 3rd, 1936, he arrives in London, and he's been accepted to come to London, come to Britain, to reside in Britain as a refugee. He's going to embark on some soft diplomacy. He's been rejected from going to Switzerland, for example, because obviously their proximity to Italy, they know he's going to embark on some political activity, and he's not able to go there. He's been accepted into Britain, and during this period, over the Second World War, Britain held many famous refugees that were here, right up to Charles de Gaulle and so forth. And it was almost an attitude of showing off for Britain in that time. Look, we can actually look after these people. They can seek their sanctuary here, and we'll be able to defend them. So the emperor was accepted as a refugee. There's a quote of Sylvia Pankhurst there, speaking about Emperor Haile Selassie, saying, "Out of Africa, a voice sounds forth, as though it was the conscience of the world." Emperor Haile Selassie, he's in London, he's on the front page of every newspaper. When he comes to Prince's Gate, which is today near the Ethiopian embassy, he waves to a sea of tens of thousands of people at that time. He's the worldwide symbol of anti-fascism. At the end of the month, the 30th of June 1936, Emperor Haile Selassie will address the League of Nations, the first head of state to stand before a council of the nations of the world and give an address in a circumstance that he's going to be appealing for his defenceless people. We're going to see a clip of that now and how the emperor is treated at the League of Nations.
At the League of Nations, a grave disturbance. Today, Haile Selassie comes to plead for his lost empire. He wants them to make Mussolini give up Ethiopia. The Geneva crowds are for him, but the exiled emperor will need his imperturbable dignity before the day is over. British Foreign Minister Eden, Soviet delegate Litvinov on the left, and French Premier Blum and all the statesmen, instead of helping Haile Selassie, have decided to lift the sanctions against Italy. The introduction of the emperor in English.
His Majesty Negus Haile Selassie, I call upon the first delegate of Ethiopia. The speech which you are about to hear will be given in the Amharic language.
In the shadows of the press gallery, Italian newspaper men are ready for an outbreak against the emperor whose country their country has taken, waiting for his first words.
From the platform.
Monsieur le Président, Monsieur le...
Trying to quell the disturbance, lights turned out. lights out. The disturbers ejected, arrested, and he is able to make his appeal.
የሚገባውንም ትክክለኛ ፍርድ ለመጠየቅ ዛሬ በዚህ ቀርቤያለሁ። ምክንያቱም ወታደሮቹ ቦምቡ በወደቀ ጊዜ ጋዙን ነፋስ እስኪወስደው ድረስ መበታተኑን ስላወቁበት ነው።
An ovation, yes, but he gets no help. The League lifts the sanctions against Italy. Applause, and that's all.
So in the 20th century, that is the moment that was widely agreed that World War II could have been averted because the principle of collective security could have been upheld. Instead, Emperor Haile Selassie, he's experiencing institutional racism. There's a mass turning a blind eye to what's happening in Ethiopia. He's being allowed to be disrespected by the Italian journalists that are there. There's a great risk that someone will try to assassinate Emperor Haile Selassie whilst he gives that speech. So you can imagine, as the lights go off in the auditorium 3 times, what the emperor is seeing. And then he has to deliver a speech with the weight of his whole nation on his shoulders about what's happening. And if you read that speech in full, you'll hear the detail that the emperor goes in terms of what is actually happening to his people. So the emperor, he doesn't get the answer he wants at the League. He knows he has to come into exile. And he can't really be in London because at that time it's politically embarrassing for the British government. They're appeasing Mussolini. And someone recommends to the emperor that he comes to Bath. And later in his life, many years later, the emperor was interviewed. And he said, I will always consider that person that recommended this city to be a true friend of mine that had my best interests at heart during that time. So the emperor, he's finding a home, he's finding a support network in the city of Bath, and he says that Fairfield gave him a renewed sense of vigour during that time, a new energy, some stability. He was able to have a familiar routine, even if it was a temporary residence. The emperor set about that routine of having his government in exile, his faith sustaining him. But this was a terrible time for Emperor Haile Selassie, and he was overwhelmed with sorrow. There was loss upon loss, both in the household. His foreign minister, Haile Selassie, passed away. The newspaper said that the emperor was distraught. The emperor and the empress had to sell all their silverware during this time because they were going through such difficult financial circumstances. But the kindness of the people of Bath and local people sustained them, and the emperor never forgot about that. This one down here says, the residents of Bath were so very kind towards us. Once a lorry load of coal was given anonymously with a note saying that they knew that we had a warm climate in Ethiopia and thought we might be cold. So things were arriving for the emperor. He had to sell his silver. He also went through some difficulties during this time. But nothing was more difficult than what was to come down the track just a few months later. This is the early part of the emperor and empress settling. This is also a family photo of the family at Fairfield House with the emperor's children up here, the crown prince, his second son, his daughter Princess Sahai, his eldest daughter Princess Tananyuwa, and his grandchildren and his youngest son down there also. And they have a different experience, and I've called this presentation The Refugee Emperor because I want us to look through it as that lens of this family coming in wartime and finding having to make a new home in Britain in very uncertain circumstances. But it would have been a different experience for each member of the family, and whilst the emperor is experiencing top-level institutional racism, people that don't want Ethiopia to exist as an African country anymore, his children might be experiencing, his son, Prince Makonnen, he was called Woolly at school because of his texture of his hair and so forth, which he took in a friendly way, but obviously it's still a comment about his appearance. And likewise, all the children would have had that different experience here. At first, the empress, she's struggling with the cold weather while she's in Britain, and she would often go on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem to alleviate this. We'll keep moving. So, as I mentioned, it's getting worse and worse for the family. There's something that happens in Ethiopia, the massacre of Addis Ababa. Almost half the population of the city, 30,000 Ethiopians, are slaughtered in 72 hours. In that slaughtering is members of the emperor and empress's direct family. This is their son-in-law, Rastesta, the husband of the emperor's eldest daughter, and the father of her 4 children. He was brutally murdered in Ethiopia, and we know that the emperor had to deliver that news. So this is a very difficult time for the family. Also, I just want to show that at this time, whilst people are offering their kindness to Fairfield House and many things were arriving, the emperor was actually saying, I would rather this go to support Ethiopian refugees. He was happy. He said that he thinks that the Lord is testing me like Job. He's afflicted. He's going through pain. He was finding some comfort in that pain and struggle, in that time far away from his country. He's almost, accepting that, I'm going to be in this difficult time. So the emperor, there was different organizations that were set up to support refugees, Ethiopian refugees, and there was garden fetes happening that the emperor would attend. Also, when he returned to Ethiopia, one of the first acts that the emperor did in 1943, I think it was, or 46, Emperor Haile Selassie initiated the Refugees Medal for those that had helped in humanitarian activity towards refugees and taking care of refugees. The emperor remembered their kindness during that time. So this really dark time for the family leads to how they sustain themselves during this period. And as well as the kindness of the people of Bath, they had their faith. And this was their chapel, the saviour of the world in exile, as it was known. The Sedetenyor Medhani Alem in Amharic. Medhani Alem means the saviour of the world. Sedetenyor is in exile. And it was also known as the house of the afflicted, or the comfort of the bereaved, because they were struggling so much. And the emperor would be in this chapel at 5 o'clock in the morning praying for his country. It's not there today, it was taken down in the 1970s, but we have a sacred garden there in the place, and people come to stand in this place because the tabot that was brought there, the Ark of the Covenant replica that makes an Ethiopian church a holy space, this came from Jerusalem, was stayed in Bath, and then went on to Addis Ababa when Ethiopia was liberated. An important moment in the chapel is when Ethiopia is finally freed in around May 1941. Her Majesty Empress Menen is reported to be in the chapel praying when the good news came to Bath, and it was reported all over the country that she was in this chapel when she heard about Ethiopia's freedom. Also relevant about the chapel is that it was the place where the funeral of Blatangeta Heroi took place. This is the foreign minister of Ethiopia. So this is really important. The family have their own tradition, and they're able to actually have that in a small, humble way in a greenhouse that's been converted into a chapel. But all the services would have taken place, the Holy Communion, the funeral rites and so forth, in their tradition. Prior to this, the emperor would use next to Fairfield House, there's a place called Partis College, which is a Christian refuge for women in destitution, and he would use the chapel for his prayers there. But when the massacre of Addis Ababa happens just before then, the emperor has decided we need to have our faith. We would like to have our church and practice the traditions of our country according to our rituals. And when the emperor returned to Ethiopia, he didn't forget how his faith had sustained him. So this is a church that's near Addis Ababa University in a place called Sidis Kilo, the area. And this church is called Sedetenyor Medhani Alem, the saviour of the world, or it has another name as well, which is Miskei Hazanan Medhani Alem, which means the consoler of the bereaved and the saviour of the world. And the tabot that was taken from Jerusalem to Bath and then went to Addis Ababa to be permanently fixed in this church And this is a special church where Emperor Haile Selassie and his family would remember their time in the city of Bath and how their faith has sustained. And this is where some of their family weddings took place. It's a very special place. And on May the 5th, which is the Ethiopian Liberation Day, that's where all the patriots that fought in Ethiopia, that's where they'll go still to this day to be close to the Tabot that was once in Ethiopia. So the emperor, he's very clear. This is that sign there in Amharic is what this says here. The emperor mentions his time in the city of Bath, and he says that he's built this church as a monument to remember the saving of our flesh and soul, and to remember our names. And that's really important, leading to what Professor Sobers was saying. When you're baptized in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, you're given a special name, and that name is to sustain you in those difficult times, and as your patron also. And my mum is actually in the room back there. And when I was 5 years old, I told my mum, about 5 or 6 years old, I told my mum I wanted to be baptized. So I don't really come from a very religious family, but at school, the message of Christ, it had entered me, and I just decided I just want to be baptized. You know, it was a special thing. And 30 years later, when I was 35, I was at this church and I asked them to baptize me, and they said yes. So this is a picture of me on my baptism. And I was given a special name, and the priest, when he baptized you, he says, never forget your name, never forget your name. And then he said, your name is Haile Selassie. So there's a reason why my baptismal name isn't on the poster for this event, because it would make everything very confusing. Haile Selassie in Bath and Wells, presented by Haile Selassie. Maybe there'll be tons of people here, you know. So that's a special connection personally that I have to this place. But at Fairfield House, when we're in our holy places, we have a prayer room that's in the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition. We also have our sacred garden, and this is the place that's on my mind when I'm in those places, those spaces, because this is our special connection. On May the 5th this year, we actually held an event that we did a live link to Addis Ababa. And when you do a live link during an event, you never know how it's going to go. But we all realised in the first 2 minutes that it was going perfectly, the connection was crystal clear. And we actually had about a 15-minute conversation with a celebration that we sponsored in Addis Ababa also. So back to the time of exile, and there were some special poems that arrived at Fairfield House, and people creatively trying to lift the emperor's spirits during this time. And I'm just going to read this one up here that was actually written in the United States, but again would have arrived at Fairfield in a publication called The Voice of Ethiopia. God and history will remember that this day. This is by Father G. Mowbray Blackett. God and history will remember this day. Thus spoke the emperor when he did pray. The League of Nations to forbear, and his petition heed and hear. Ethiopia's cause he did present, and asked the nations to repent. Their lavish tricks he did expose, and warn them to change before he closed. With calm, deliberate poise and voice, he left the nations not a choice. They stood before the world at large, guilty of his ringing charge. Recounting history step by step, he proved the world owed him a debt. For sign he did with them a pact, on which they now had turned their back. Conscience in them he proved was dead. Their honour too from them had fled. They stood no longer for the right, so strong was their belief in might. He argued that security, impossible for them would be, if they that thing they would secure, when Ethiopia would be no more. God and history will remember this very day, and history will record what he did say. The prophet's voice he raised on high, proclaiming that their doom is nigh. The West will perish, warned the king. No sooner said, behold the thing. We ask what manner of man is he, who brings things to pass so speedily. And so Emperor Haile Selassie in 1938, 5 years is a long time in exile, a period of, a lot can change. And he's settling into Bath, and Ethiopia is kind of drifting away from the headlines. the Spanish Civil War has taken over, anxieties with Germany happening. And Emperor Haile Selassie, particularly in 1938, he embarks on travelling all across the UK. He sent his grandchildren to school across the UK, his children to school, and now he takes the opportunity to pop up in many of those places to visit. So nearby to us, Bridgewater, Stagursey, the Emperor is in Stagursey, and he wrote in the signing book, "Thy will be done," and signed it Haile Selassie. So we're looking for that. We'd love to have, be a great item to find. Haile Selassie's in Bristol. He sees a cinema, a movie about Ethiopia. He's in Malvern. He's in Liverpool. He's in Cambridge. This is just a handful. Penzance Street. This street I want to talk about because, again, very local. The Emperor, he opened a Methodist All Nations Bazaar, it was called, in the Crispin Hall. 4,000 people were in the street outside the Crispin Hall to see Emperor Haile Selassie open this event. And when he did speak at this event, Dr. Eglinton, who was an important man back there, said to the Emperor in front of everyone, he said, "Your Majesty, in our town we have a tradition that Joseph of Arimathea visited here. But now that the Emperor of Ethiopia, Haile Selassie, has visited, this will become a greater legend than that." That's what he said to Emperor Haile Selassie. When the Emperor is in Hartland, in North Devon, I just want to share this part from the Emperor which will show where his mind is and how it's such a juxtaposition. The Emperor opening a church faith juxtaposed with what's going on in his head. The Emperor said at his speech at Hartland, he said, "Independence cherished for many thousands of years is being cruelly oppressed in my country. Women are weeping, where is my husband? Children are crying, where is my mother? Where is my father? The Almighty and merciful God may bring peace to these afflicted people in his own way." I would like to finally say that I hope you all have an enjoyable time at this bazaar, which I have much pleasure in declaring open, you know? So, the Emperor, but he's taking the opportunity to speak about what's happening in his country and remind people, you know, and it might not fit the exact environment that he's in, but he's there to say it. I now want to do a special slide about the Emperor's visit to Wales, because it's in this context, as far as I can see, of the Emperor travelling around the country. You know, he's filling his time, he's on a visit, he's on different visits around, and he's also interested in the Christian faith. This is the high seat of Christianity in this county. So the Emperor would have probably maybe been driving past on his way to another place, and he said, "You know what, I would like to visit the cathedral." But as soon as the Emperor arrived in Wales, word started to spread in the city that Emperor Haile Selassie was here, and it says a large crowd followed him into the cathedral through the south door. Now Jess says that the south door must be the bishop's door today that the Emperor came in. So the Emperor entered the south door, evensong was going on, and he leaned up against a pillar. Now, we don't know what pillar it is, but I have been leaning against all the pillars in Wales, and I have my favourite pillar that I think that the Emperor was leaning up against. And then he left, and I imagine that the Emperor then probably made another private visit, but without the pandemonium, because it strikes to me a similar story when the Emperor went to Bristol Zoo. There, all of a sudden, there was a huge crowd there, and he decided that, you know, there might have been some massacre or something that he just heard about, and he wasn't in the mood for that public engagement, so he quickly got his family and they left. So likewise, the Emperor, he probably didn't want to disturb the service, but he wanted to see the cathedral, then he's on his way also. So there's more research to be done about the visit of Emperor Haile Selassie. Now from Wales to Wales, and Swansea in particular, because Emperor Haile Selassie, he sent his nephew to the Bible College in Swansea, and there was a very interesting man called Reverend Rhys Howes, who in the history of the Second World War, the 20th century, is a very interesting character. He's here, and he has this method of prayer called intercessional prayer, but his own idea behind it, and he's engaging in intercessional prayer battles where they expect to be defeated, but they dig in and eventually they're able to overcome, to appeal to the Lord, to actually get some help. Emperor Haile Selassie visited the Bible College of Wales a number of times, and in 1939, in August, he went to stay on a 2-week camp, a Bible camp, camping with mostly refugee boys here. The emperor is there, and he tells Reverend Rees Howes, I'm a refugee myself during this time. Emperor Haile Selassie, he takes part in the prayer battles that they're having and they pray for Ethiopia. Reverend Howes speaks about it in the book, The Intercessor. And in response, the emperor wrote to Rees Howes, he said, it's an inspiration to me to see all the things that the Lord has been leading me to do amongst those of your own people and those who have sought refuge in your country. The prayer battle must have been intense, because whilst the emperor is in camp, right at the end is the formal announcement of World War II. September the 3rd, 1939, Emperor Haile Selassie is in the Bible College of Wales. At that moment, the emperor would have known that everything's about to change, because now Hitler and Mussolini are together, the Allied nations, the lines have been drawn, Ethiopia is going to become one of those central allies, and this is his chance to return to Ethiopia. And return he does on May the 5th, 1941, with British and Ethiopian support. Emperor Haile Selassie returns his capital, Addis Ababa, and he sits once again on his throne. He tells his people that today is the day which we have defeated our enemy. Therefore, when we say, let us rejoice with our hearts, let not our rejoicing be in any other way, but in the Spirit of Christ. Do not return evil for evil. Do not indulge in the atrocities which the enemy has been practicing in his usual way, even to the last. Meanwhile, in Bath, we have our most significant party, the Fairfield House, the party house, not just the party house, but a lot of good parties happen there, celebrations. In May 1941, Her Majesty held a celebration of Ethiopia's freedom. Over 60 guests were in attendance. The Mayor of Bath is toasting the Emperor back on his throne. It was a joyous moment for the supporters of Ethiopia to see that finally justice had been restored there. And the Emperor, 13 years later, he returns to Britain. He's on a state visit this time. He becomes a Knight of the Garter on that visit. He's with Queen Elizabeth just after her coronation. And he's given all the pomp and ceremony. He's not a refugee, he's a state visitor, he's a celebrated visitor. The Emperor's due to visit Bath again, and also after his state visit to go on a 2-week holiday in the UK. And the journalists ask the Emperor, they come to ask him, Your Majesty, what are you most looking forward to seeing on your travels in Britain? And the Emperor tells them this. He says, I'm most looking forward to seeing Fairfield House again, my house. And I will always look upon the West Country as my second home. That's because of the kindness of the people. Then the Emperor, when he gets back to Ethiopia, he decides that he's going to give this house as a gift to the city of Bath, and he wants it to be used for the good of the elderly. And that's what happens at Fairfield House today. During the working week, Fairfield House is home to a number of charities that help with the elderly and vulnerable people in the city of Bath. So Bemska, Hard at Work, the Townsendmen's Guild use the building. We also have Headway, the Brain Injury Association, First Impressions, help women that are out of the workforce get back into the workforce, Coon Down Holiday Trust, and other charities and organisations that are based there at the house. Fairfield House is also a place of celebration for the Ethiopian community and the Rastafari community. And in modern time, it's a place of heritage. This is a story that we're telling all through the year with our historical guided tours. That's me doing a tour earlier this week. And also with items that belong to Emperor Haile Selassie returning to us. This is the Emperor's symbol on his wallet that has just returned to us and is going to be in our museum. So there's a demand for heritage and for telling the Emperor's story because of what's happening in the world. And because it's that World War II story just before, people want to know about this story now. And that's why Fairfield House is number 2 on the best things to do on TripAdvisor, according to our So you'll have to visit on a Sunday or otherwise and come and do the history tour that we offer, or when we're having another important celebration. But I just want to end with what the Emperor's legacy, wider legacy, means to us at Fairfield House. So for us it's a local story, it's about Bath and that changing narrative in the city of Bath. Bath being a place that welcomes refugees, Bath that has this important African history, to be something to be proud of. Emperor of Ethiopia was in the city. This is important for people of Bath of all ethnicities. For Ethiopians and people of African descent, Emperor Haile Selassie is a massive figure for them, and that's a huge part of what we do at Fairfield House. Actually host celebrations of people all across the African diaspora that see themselves representing the story and want to celebrate there. The Emperor has an important place for faith, as we've heard from Professor Sobers, for morality, for justice, for humanity. Later in his life, Emperor Haile Selassie spoke to the United Nations and gave a famous, very famous words against racism, where he says, until the philosophy which holds one race superior and another inferior is finally and permanently discredited, abandoned, there will be no peace on earth. Anti-fascism. Look where we are right now and how important that stance was, and this is about actually choosing your side and knowing what's right and just. We believe that Emperor Haile Selassie has a noble vision for the world and for those small peoples of the world that he said he was there to defend when he spoke to the United Nations. Someone in history has stood up for them. It was this Emperor of Ethiopia. To finish, I just want to tell a short story about earlier this year. We were approached in May for an event, and this organisation, they said to us, we want this to happen at Fairfield House. It has to happen at Fairfield House. That organisation was called Sudafest, and the event that they wanted to hold was the first Bath Refugee Festival. They asked us to hold that event in June. June is the month that Emperor Haile Selassie came to Britain as a refugee, and when he spoke to the League of Nations on behalf of all those small peoples of the world. So this is really important to us. We realise that there's something supernatural going on here, and we can just agree, and we just have to do what we can to make this celebration an amazing celebration for the first Bath Refugee Festival and the successive Bath Refugee Festival to happen at the home of the Emperor of Ethiopia. And it did happen. It was our biggest ever celebration, and we had beautiful weather, almost 400 attendees, the Mayor of Bath there, and it was a wonderful occasion, and we are very thankful for that. And we're thankful for this opportunity to tell you about it as well. Thank you very much.
I just wanted to say there's another bit of serendipity that happened, which was that actually Bishop Michael, you alerted the Chancellor, who alerted me to this connection to Wells Cathedral. And we were looking in our archives to see if we could find any further evidence of the Emperor's visit here, which we haven't as yet been able to, but it's an ongoing piece of research. But through that, I came to Fairfield House, met you and Shawn. On that day, happened to notice through Paula, I knew the Tapestry was coming, found out that Haile Selassie was in fact on the Tapestry, and then this has just happened, hasn't it?
Yeah.
So it's been fantastic. Thank you so much. We're going to open up for questions now.
Yeah, I'm very intrigued. So Italy is a Christian nation. It invaded Ethiopia, but they seem to present some sort of religious justification for the invasion. What's the story there?
So it's very, in that time with the fascism, Mussolini throwing his weight around, definitely he was trying to force the Pope into that. But there's also some motivation for the Roman Catholic Church to absorb Ethiopia as well. And I think that's sort of illustrated in Shawn's talk with the history of the church, with all these sacred manuscripts with texts and so forth. And there's a horrifying scenes from that you can see film clip with Italian priest blessing the bombs to be dropped on the Ethiopians during that time. So the emperor, he was very clear in his autobiography about how he felt about that. He was asking, he opens his autobiography with a prayer, and it's essentially saying, "O Lord, only you know why you have made these Italians rise to the top with this abuse of Ethiopia, and us faithful Ethiopians sink to a sea of despair for this time," So he was looking at a greater reason for it.
The political answer, away from the religious answer, is that in 1896 there was a battle called the Battle of Adwa. This is when Italy first tried to conquer Ethiopia. A very famous battle known as Battle of Adwa, and that's when Ethiopians defeated the Italians. So this became a very embarrassing moment for the Italians. Fast forwarding to Mussolini's time, Italy joined the scramble for Africa very late, after lots of the other European countries. They always had designs on the east of Africa, Eritrea, Somalia, and those kind of areas, and they called it the East Italian Empire. So Mussolini, looking to nation build Ethiopia, wanted to avenge the embarrassment of the Battle of Adwa, but also nation build the morale of the Italians. So that's again why they wanted to go into Ethiopia.
Could you outline briefly the later years of his life after he returned to Addis Ababa? And I believe, for example, he was reburied.
When the emperor returned to Addis Ababa in 1941, he then goes into a period of trying to build back his nation. He invests heavily in the education system. He becomes like the minister of education in the Ethiopian government for a number of decades, because he wants to educate a new generation to build the future of Ethiopia. He's lost swathes of young Ethiopians during the wartime. So he's focused on education, of reopening his parliament and so forth. And it's not until that time in the 1950s that the emperor embarks on travelling to other places. Britain, although they came to Ethiopia's aid, the emperor did have a bit of a headache to actually get rid of them, because the occupied enemy territory administration took over, and they were very heavy-handed. There was a lot of South African troops that were there, and the Ethiopians became very unhappy. They said, why have we defeated one colonizer for another one? So the emperor shifted his sphere of influence, his attention towards America, towards other places, to help build back Ethiopia during that time. And when he returned in 1954, that's him saying, I've forgotten all that, I'm pleased to be back in Britain during that time. In the 1960s, Emperor Haile Selassie founded what became the African Union. So all the nations of Africa called to Addis Ababa, and the emperor plays this father figure role and forms the African Union. Then towards the end, in the 60s, there's a number of attempts at revolution in Ethiopia, and in 1974 they succeed with a very vocal student and military population marching against the emperor during that time, overthrowing his government. That's now known as the Red Terror, and it caused the 7th biggest genocide in world history of its time. So Ethiopia went dark in a way, and they didn't want to tell anyone about the emperor's legacy. They didn't teach it in schools, what he had done and so forth. It was taboo to mention his names in many aspects and so forth. And it was mysterious about what happened to him also. And in the year 2000, or in the 1990s, at the end of the Derg, they found remains which they said that was the emperor, and reburied those in the year 2000. So that's the first time that Ethiopians had a chance to mourn this great figure for them during that time. And it's only still now the Ethiopian government is reopening some of the emperor's palaces and so forth that they're actually having that conversation now. Fairfield House is almost leading the way, in a sense.
Thank you.
I just want, again, take it from a slightly different angle, because at Fairfield House there was news at the time in the 1930s, when he was in exile, and the emperor got known by Dr. Malachi Bayan, who was his protege, if you like, coming from Ethiopia, and he was in a mission in Harlem in America, and he was working for the liberation of Ethiopia. But Dr. Malachi Bayan sent word back to the emperor at Fairfield House that actually fundraising was happening for Ethiopia, but it wasn't all joined up and not all the money was coming back. So what the emperor did, to cut a long story short, was through the work of Dr. Malachi Bayan established the Ethiopian World Federation, and this was established for the diaspora to galvanise support for Ethiopia for the liberation. This had a very significant impact because in Jamaica, the early Rastafari movement, who in 1930 saw the divinity of the emperor, lots of the heads of the different, what's called mansions, was like denominations within Rastafari, became members of the Ethiopian World Federation. And that helped galvanise an Ethiopianism in Jamaica that spread across the Caribbean, that spread across the diaspora. So it's been the Rastafari that have helped keep the legacy and the name of Haile Selassie in public consciousness. And we know that through reggae, obviously Bob Marley and these kind of things. So when his influence and name was diminishing in Ethiopia for all the reasons that Ras Benji's talked about, it was actually incredibly strong in the diaspora. And now it's kind of a cross line where those things are starting to join up again. The elders of in Ethiopia has continued to revere the emperor. They don't see him in the same way that the Rastafari do, but they still see him as a very significant figure with that Solomonic line. So he's still revered in that holy way, if you like. So now we are seeing a convergence of the young people in Ethiopia starting to recognise the significance and the power of the emperor, and that name is rising up again, and we're seeing Ethiopia bringing that to prominence. But there's still a long way to go. The government there, there's still work to do, but it's not as repressed as it was at some point.
Following on from the last question, is there what can you say about the Emperor's family now? And is there a pretender?
His son.
So the Emperor's family, his grandchildren and great-grandchildren, they're around. They live in the United States. Some of them have returned to live in Ethiopia. They are officially like a monarchy in exile. They're not recognised by the Ethiopian state. Although on some occasions, like the opening of the National Palace recently, they'll invite Ethiopian royal family members to come and to see the palace and how they're presenting the Emperor's legacy. At Fairfield House, we're lucky and we have quite a few royal visits every year that we have to prepare for. And it's usually fantastic. There's the Emperor, he in 1973 announced that his grandson, Prince Zara Jakob, was the inheritor of the throne. And Prince Zara Jakob is still alive and lives in Ethiopia. I think he's 70 years old. And he lives a very quiet and private life. There's another prince called Prince Ermias Haile Selassie, and Prince Ermias is the son of the emperor's youngest son, the emperor's grandson, and he's the president of the Crown Council of Ethiopia, which is the formal body that represent the Ethiopian crown. And they will make speeches on particular occasions, present awards, and do other business of a crown in exile in this time.
And just the other thing to add to that, the emperor's granddaughter, Empress Princess Esther Antonin Selassie, she was on the board of Fairfield House for a time. Her daughter now, Princess Alexandra Antonin Selassie, she's on the current board, co-chair as well. So we have very strong connections at Fairfield House with the Ethiopian royal family. And many of them have been there. Prince Haile Selassie, the head of the Crown Council, has been there. We do maintain those links. But Zara Jakob, interestingly, he was very closely connected with the Rastafari. One of the mansions is called 12 Tribes of Israel. And he was very aligned with the 12 Tribes of Israel Rastafari mansion. So again, these connections are very strong. There is a kind of underground, if you like, will to want to restore the monarchy, but it's not really an overground movement in terms of lots of campaigns and things like that. But the will and the spirit is still there. Whether it will come to pass, we shall see.
Yeah, thanks very much. So, I've experienced the issues associated with sort of organising meetings in Ethiopia, and I'm just curious as to whether there are links between Church, Selassie, and the continued use of the Julian and the Gregorian calendar.
What's that question side that? What's the actual question? So I
just wonder if there are links between Selassie, like obviously the Church, but
yeah.
So I don't know.
The links between the family. When you say Selassie, the Haile Selassie and the Church.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah. From understanding the question correctly, I mean, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church is still very active. It's, in Bristol, we've got a church, Eritrean church as well. The Eritrean church received autocephaly from the Ethiopian church, and London, so I'm still not quite sure if I understand the question.
In January, I was lucky enough to be in Ethiopia, and I attended the reconsecration of Holy Trinity Cathedral. So in Amharic, that's Haile Selassie. And the Ethiopian Crown Council that we mentioned on the question before, the Emperor's grandson, he led on the fundraising campaign for this to be restored. So as Shawn says, like in an underground way, the royal family is still moving and shaking, doing different things that they're able to do. And on that occasion, they were VIPs at the church, the family, and the very old bishops of Ethiopia were speaking very emotionally about what the emperor has done for the country. And it was like you could hear a pin drop amongst 10,000 people, because no one had spoke these words in such a place for decades, and then they were saying it openly, what our emperor has done for us, he's given us all of this. Yeah, I think that was addressing. Right. Was that addressing?
Yeah, I guess having gone there first, so I picked up the newspaper and it gives you the date in the Gregorian and the Julian calendar, and I'm just curious as to how that persists and whether there was any influence from the church, or whether there was influence.
I mean, the Ethiopia still uses the Julian calendar, which is 7 years behind the current calendar here, and that's still a very strong tradition. I mean, when you go to Ethiopia, they work in a dual way. They can say their dates, but they would also say our dates simultaneously. Do you know what I mean? And they live in that dual way. So, and also time. There's a church time, and then there's kind of secular time. But when you're in Ethiopia, they will, you kind of know which one they're referring to. It can get slightly confusing, but it's still very strong. There's no will. It's my joke within the light bulb. There's no will within the Orthodox Church to move to the Gregorian calendar. It is established. That's how it is. True faith. That's not changing anytime soon.
So just to add to that, my understanding is that the Gregorian calendar is more accurate to the movement of the planets, to the actual measure of time, and the Ethiopian calendar stays accurate to the holidays and the festivals that Jesus Christ would have experienced as a Jewish person. So they're very locked in that Easter must never cross over with Passover in the Orthodox, the Julian calendar, whereas it often will change around in the Western calendar and so forth.
I'm just wondering what's happened to the ancient treasures that the Ethiopians had. You mentioned the Ark of the Covenant, and those, are they still preserved and kept precious?
Yeah. The Ark of the Covenant is still in Ethiopia, St. Mary's Iron Church. No one can see it. There's a priest, the high priest, that's him alone is guards the church, and not even like the emperors and president, prime minister, and these kind of things. Not allowed access. It's heavily secure. There's treasures, the Magdala treasures, which the British troops brought to Britain, now in the British Museum, and they continue to be in the British Museum. There is a campaign for them to be repatriated forward to Ethiopia. That's an ongoing conversation and debate, which is very deep. But as with those repatriation conversations, they've also been victim to, culture wars and, these kind of bigger conversations in relation to Elgin marbles and these kind of things. But there is an ongoing delegation. Within the British Museum, they have tabots, as Rasbenji said. They are the replica of the Ark of the Covenant, and every church has one for it to be consecrated. They have tabots within the British Museum that no one is allowed to see. The British government and the museum have agreed that no one is allowed to see them. Even in a church, it's only the priests and the deacons that are allowed to see it. So they're holding things within their warehouses that no one is allowed to see. They're not allowed to put it on display, but they still refuse to send it back. So there's these ironies there about, obviously ownership, which runs deep. But there are agreements within the Ethiopian Orthodox Church that priests are allowed to go there, and they do have these quiet times when they go there and they pray on the tabots, etc. But yeah, there's much more work to do. There's a famous Rastafari called Ras Seymour MacLean, and he went through a process of liberating these artifacts back and bringing them back to Ethiopia. And he's kind of been well documented. He had to go to court because was he stealing them, and all these kind of things. But he was liberating them back. So
I think it's amazing, and through all the wars and things, that they're still guarded, as you said. They haven't been bombed, or in today's world, things are so different.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
But that is still the case.
Yeah.
We've got one more question.
Could you elaborate a bit more on the link you mentioned briefly about the Emperor's time in Wales? Because British and Ethiopian Christianity share a common origin in the 1st century that the Emperor kind of explored while he was in Britain.
So I think...
Can you just repeat the question?
Yeah. I just wanted you to elaborate a bit more on the link that the Emperor explored while he was in Britain, like you mentioned when he visited Street. The British and Ethiopian Christianity have a common 1st century origin that the Emperor explored while he was in exile.
Yeah, so later in the 1950s, the Emperor said that the Church of Britain and the Church of Ethiopia came into origin at the same time. So he's alluding to that Britain is 1st century, Joseph of Arimathea came to Glastonbury and returned to Glastonbury after the crucifixion and built up what became the Abbey and so forth. And in the 1930s in Britain, this was super popular as well. In Glastonbury, apparently, that they would have a tradition where they would always set a dinner place at a family meal just in case Jesus returned. So yeah, that's a tradition. And the Emperor, he is moving around in those places in Cornwall, throughout Somerset, and in particular, he goes on holiday and stays at Burnham-on-Sea, which is where Joseph and Jesus were said to arrive, and called a place Paradise. And the Emperor stayed on Rectory Road, which is Paradise today during that time. So I think probably it just gave him some comfort, the same as he's looking up, he would have been reading the Psalms of David, thinking about David's exile a lot. He was reading Napoleon at Fairfield House, thinking about Napoleon, and the Emperor maybe would have been walking around the Somerset thinking perhaps Jesus Christ was here once upon a time. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I know that there's one last thing that's going to happen, isn't there? Which is a very, very special occasion. So, do you want to?
Yeah, we have a present from Fairfield House to present to Wells Cathedral. And it is a framed picture of the Emperor and a newspaper report of Emperor Haile Selassie visiting the cathedral. Yeah, that's all have. Yeah. Come on,
So the article reads, the nameless visits Wells, crowd follows him into cathedral. Haile Selassie I, Emperor of Abyssinia, paid an informal visit to Wells on Saturday afternoon. His Majesty was accompanied by members of his family and suite, and although no intimation that he intended visiting the city had been received, the news spread rapidly. And when the Negus and his party entered the cathedral by the south door, a large crowd gathered round him. The royal party arrived at the cathedral shortly after evensong had commenced, and His Majesty stood, leaning against a pillar, listening to the service for several minutes. The party did not stay long and left by the north door. While in Wells, the royal family inspected several of the city's points of interest. On behalf of the cathedral, please can I say a huge thank you to you for this. It's wonderful, and we will claim Haile Selassie as one of our.